If you get married someday, you probably assume you'll be the one who decides. You'll meet someone, you'll fall for them, and eventually you'll choose them out of everyone on the planet to build a life with. For almost all of human history, that assumption would have sounded insane. Not because ancient people didn't fall in love. They did, plenty of it, in poems and letters and graffiti scratched into ancient walls. But love and marriage were, for most of our species' existence, two almost completely separate systems. One was a feeling, the other was infrastructure, as load-bearing to a community's survival as food sharing or shelter. Somewhere along the way, those two systems collided, merged, and produced the version most of us live inside today, where you're expected to find both in the same person. That merger is only a few hundred years old. Everything before it ran on a completely different logic. So who actually chose your spouse for the other 300,000 years? Who were you forbidden to marry, and why did that rule show up independently, almost everywhere? What did a spouse actually cost? And when, exactly, did anyone decide that love should be a requirement instead of a bonus? Let's take it apart. Start with the basic problem marriage was actually solving. A single forager, alone, is bad at almost everything a human needs to do to stay alive long term. Hunting is unreliable. Gathering is seasonal. Childcare is constant. No one person, on their own, can cover food, defense, shelter, and raising the next generation at the same time. Marriage was one of the tools that solved that problem. It didn't just join two people. It joined two families, two networks of aunts and cousins and in-laws into one larger unit that could share labor, share food during a bad season, and back each other up in a conflict. A spouse wasn't just a partner. A spouse was an alliance. In 2011, anthropologists Robert Walker, Kim Hill, Mark Flynn, and Robert Ellsworth ran the numbers on this directly, analyzing marriage practices across a global sample of hunter-gatherer societies. What they found, in roughly 85% of the societies studied, marriages were arranged, not chosen. Parents or close kin picked the spouse, not the two people getting married. And in about 80% of those societies, the marriage involved some kind of formal economic exchange between families, a bride price, a period of bride service, or a reciprocal gift exchange. That's the part that gets lost in the modern picture of primitive romance. Marriage, across almost the entire archaeological and ethnographic record, wasn't a private decision between two hearts. It was closer to a merger between two boards of directors, and the boards were your relatives. One finding from that same study is worth sitting with. The prevalence of arranged marriage didn't correlate with climate, food scarcity, population density, or how nomadic a group was. Environment didn't predict it. Something about arranged, family-negotiated marriage seems to have been independently useful to human groups almost everywhere, regardless of what kind of world they were living in. Even the groups often held up as the exception prove the point. Among some African hunter-gatherer populations included in that research, courtship-based marriage, where the two people involved had more direct say, was more common than in other regions, and the researchers flagged this as a reason ancestral human marriage patterns are hard to pin down with total confidence. Human groups clearly experimented with more than one system, but the version that ended up dominant, across the largest share of societies on record, was the one run through the family. Before any of that alliance building could happen, humans had to solve a much older, much stranger problem first: who you were not allowed to marry. Every documented human society, without exception, has some version of an incest taboo. That's remarkable on its own. Cultures with wildly different gods, diets, and family structures all independently arrived at the same rule. You don't marry your sibling, and in almost all of them, you don't marry your parent or your child either. For a long time, the assumption was that this had to be a taught rule, something drilled into children, because the biological cost of inbreeding is otherwise invisible to a child deciding who they're attracted to. Then, in 1891, Finnish anthropologist Edvard Westermark proposed something stranger, that humans don't actually need the rule taught to them, because something in early development does the job automatically. The evidence for this arrived decades later, from an unlikely place, Israeli kibbutzim, where unrelated children were raised together in communal peer groups from infancy, sleeping in the same rooms, essentially growing up as siblings. Researchers tracked marriage patterns across thousands of kibbutz-raised adults and found something striking. Out of close to 3,000 marriages among people who'd grown up on the same kibbutz, only 14 were between members of the same childhood peer group, and none of those 14 had actually lived together before the age of 6. Close, sustained physical proximity in early childhood appears to flip a switch that makes later sexual attraction to that person feel, to most people, actively unappealing, whether or not you're biologically related to them at all. A separate line of evidence pointed the same direction from a completely different culture. In parts of early 20th century Taiwan, a custom called minor marriage involved adopting a baby girl into a household specifically to raise her alongside her future husband from infancy. Those marriages, arranged for economic convenience and finalized once the children were grown, consistently showed higher divorce rates, lower birth rates, and more reported infidelity than marriages between two people who hadn't grown up together. The aversion showed up whether the culture wanted it to or not. Ancient humans almost certainly weren't reasoning their way to the incest taboo through careful genetic logic. Evolution had already built the aversion in, at the exact age it needed to work. So the people you grew up next to were mostly off the table, automatically. But ancient communities were small, sometimes only a few dozen people. If you can't marry the people right next to you, and you can't easily travel to meet total strangers, who's actually left? The answer, across an enormous range of unrelated cultures, was a very specific kind of cousin. Anthropologists draw a distinction between two types of cousins that most modern people never think about. Parallel cousins are the children of your parents' opposite-sex sibling, your father's sister's kids, or your mother's brother's kids. In society after society, marrying a parallel cousin was treated as close to incestuous, almost sibling-like. Marrying a cross-cousin, by contrast, was frequently preferred, sometimes even expected. The distinction sounds arbitrary until you see what it was actually doing. Cross-cousin marriage kept a family's wealth, land, and obligations circulating within a known, trusted kin network, while still counting as marrying outward, into a different household, sealing an alliance between two family lines instead of collapsing back into one. It solved two problems with one rule. It was distant enough to avoid the automatic aversion the Westermarck effect had already built in, and it was close enough that both families already knew exactly who they were getting. This wasn't a minor, regional custom. Versions of preferred cross-cousin marriage show up independently among indigenous groups across Australia, in parts of South India, throughout sub-Saharan Africa, and among many indigenous societies of the Americas, cultures with no contact with each other, no shared ancestor culture to copy the idea from. When the same solution shows up that many times, independently invented, it's usually a sign the underlying problem was universal too. Even once the pool of acceptable spouses was narrowed down, one more question remained, and it's the one that would feel most alien to a lot of people today. Who inside that pool actually made the decision? Go back to that number from the 2011 hunter-gatherer study. 85% arranged, largely by parents or close kin. This wasn't unique to foraging societies either. It carried straight through into the earliest written legal codes we have. The Code of Hammurabi, carved in Babylon around 1754 BCE, includes clauses on what happens to a marriage contract if the bride's father dies, how a dowry is handled, and what a husband owes if he sets a wife aside. All of it framed as an agreement between families and their patriarchs, not a decision between two individuals. Ancient Rome ran on a similar logic, formalized even further. A Roman father held patria potestas, legal authority over his children that extended well into adulthood, and a daughter's first marriage was, in practice, arranged by him. Girls could be considered marriageable at 12, boys at 14. Consent was technically required from both parties under Roman law, but when your own father held that much legal and economic power over your life, consent and compliance tended to blur together. Here's the detail that trips people up the most. This wasn't experienced at the time as oppression in the way it reads today. In a world where your survival, your children's survival, and your family's standing all depended on the marriage going well economically, letting two infatuated 20-year-olds make that call alone would have looked reckless. The ancient equivalent of letting a teenager co-sign your mortgage because they liked the house. Negotiations could stretch out for years before a wedding actually happened. Betrothals were sometimes arranged while the children involved were still small, formalized long before either of them had any say, with the actual marriage and cohabitation delayed until both had reached an age the community considered ready. The choosing and the marrying were treated as two separate events, sometimes a decade apart, and the first one almost never belonged to the couple. If marriage was fundamentally an economic alliance, it makes sense that it usually came with an actual price tag. That 2011 hunter-gatherer study found formal economic exchange in roughly 80% of the societies studied, and it broke down into a few recurring patterns. Bride price was a payment, often in livestock, tools, or labor, from the groom's family to the bride's family, compensating them for the loss of her labor and future children to another household. Bride service ran the opposite direction in effort. Instead of paying up front, a groom might work for his prospective in-laws for months or years, proving his usefulness before the marriage was finalized. And dowry, more common in agricultural and stratified societies, sent wealth the other way, from the bride's family toward the new household, often functioning as her financial security if the marriage ended. Bride service, in particular, could be a serious multi-year commitment. Among some documented hunter-gatherer and small-scale farming societies, a young man was expected to live and work alongside his prospective wife's family, hunting, building, and providing for them, for a period stretching anywhere from several months to several years, before the marriage was considered finalized and he could bring her back to his own group. It was, in effect, a working interview for the rest of his life, judged by his future in-laws rather than by her alone. Mesopotamia had all of this written into law. The Code of Hammurabi lays out specific rules about what happens to a dowry if a wife dies without children, and what a husband is entitled to keep versus return. In ancient Rome, a bride's dowry, the dose, was handed over at marriage, and depending on whether the marriage was contracted with Manius or without it, that property either became fully her husband's or stayed legally hers, managed but not owned by him. None of this was subtle. A marriage came with a contract, a valuation, and often a paper trail, because in a world without banks, insurance, or a social safety net, marriage was one of the only mechanisms available for moving wealth, labor, and security between families in a structured, enforceable way. Here's the question that's genuinely hard to answer and worth being honest about. Did any of this actually work better or worse than what came after it? It's tempting to assume arranged, family-negotiated marriage must have been miserable, a life sentence handed down by someone else's decision. Some of it certainly was. Ancient legal codes are full of clauses about what happens when a marriage goes catastrophically wrong, which tells you it went wrong often enough to need writing down. Age gaps could be enormous, and the balance of power, especially for young brides, could be brutal. But the honest answer is also that we don't have a clean way to measure happiness across 300,000 years of oral, undocumented relationships. What we can say is that a marriage system built around family investment and community accountability had one structural advantage a purely individual choice doesn't. Everyone around the couple had a direct financial and social stake in the marriage succeeding. Divorce didn't just end a relationship, it unwound an alliance, a dowry, a set of mutual obligations between two extended families who still had to live near each other afterward. That gave a lot of people a strong practical incentive to help a struggling marriage work rather than simply let it dissolve. That's not an argument that arranged marriage was better. It's a reminder that the two systems were optimized for genuinely different things, one for the stability of a wider kinship network, the other for the emotional fulfillment of the two people in the marriage. Comparing them head-to-head is a little like comparing a suspension bridge to a hammock. They're not failed versions of each other. They're built for different loads. Modern research on contemporary arranged marriages, in places where the practice is still common today, adds a genuinely surprising wrinkle to this. Several studies comparing long-term satisfaction between arranged and self-chosen marriages have found the two converge over time. Self-chosen marriages often start out reporting higher satisfaction, while arranged marriages tend to report satisfaction that grows gradually across the years, eventually landing in a similar place. Love, in other words, doesn't have to come first to end up present. Sometimes it seems to be something a marriage grows, rather than something it starts with. So when did marrying for love become the default expectation instead of a lucky bonus? Historian Stephanie Kuntz, who has written extensively on the history of marriage, traces the shift to a specific and surprisingly recent window, the late 18th and 19th centuries, mostly in Western Europe and North America. Enlightenment ideas about individual liberty and personal happiness started to seep into how people thought marriage should work. At the same time, industrialization was pulling young adults out of family farms and into wage labor in cities, which meant, for the first time at scale, that a person's economic survival didn't automatically depend on their parents' approval of their spouse. That combination, philosophical and economic, is what made companionate marriage, marrying primarily for love and compatibility, thinkable as a norm rather than a rare exception. It didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen everywhere at the same pace. In large parts of the world today, family-arranged and family-influenced marriage is still the norm, not a relic. There's a strange irony sitting underneath this shift, and it's worth naming directly. The moment marriage stopped being primarily an economic alliance is roughly the same moment divorce rates started climbing. That's not a coincidence, and it's not necessarily bad news either. It's the predictable cost of switching a system's core design goal from family stability to individual fulfillment. You get more people leaving marriages that make them unhappy. You also lose some of the outside structural support that used to hold marriages together through the hard years, whether or not both people were happy. So which version got it right? Realistically, neither one, cleanly. The ancient system had genuine strengths modern marriage often lacks: a wide network of relatives with real skin in the game, economic partnerships that outlasted any single bad year, and a structural safety net for when things went wrong. It also had genuine costs. Very little individual say. Marriages struck at ages that would horrify us today, and outcomes that depended heavily on your family's status and leverage rather than your own judgment. The modern version flips almost all of that. You get to choose. You get to walk away. You get to marry or not marry entirely on your own terms, based on nothing but how you actually feel about another person. That's an extraordinary, historically rare freedom, and most people would never trade it back. But it also means the marriage stands almost entirely on two people's ongoing feelings, without the wider family and community infrastructure that used to prop it up when those feelings inevitably wavered. For nearly the entire span of our species, who you married was decided by people who weren't you, for reasons that had almost nothing to do with your feelings, and it worked well enough, generation after generation, to get you here. The version where you get to choose is barely a few centuries old. It's still, in a sense, the experiment. And so far, it's the one nearly everyone who's ever had the option has chosen to keep running.